All right, so this is with a one-wire oxygen sensor that I had lying around. It's not the correct one for this S10, but it'll work for demonstration. So the computer cannot see an oxygen sensor right now, so it's just running off the base map. So I got that amount of voltage right there, just sitting here idling. I'm gonna give it a snort of carb cleaner and watch the voltage. All right, here's another one. So you can see giving it a little shot of fuel produces more voltage out of the sensor, meaning that the sensor is seeing a rich mixture. So that appears to be working right. And then if I unplug this PCB line, it goes rich when I cover it up. As soon as I let go, so adding air to the mixture seems to change it. So this sensor seems to work. I'm gonna hook this one up to the computer and see what happens. All right, so I have the computer in the oxygen sensor test mode, whatever that's called. So there you can see the OBD1 port. So the A and B pin, you jump with the key off in order to read codes. Or sorry, you jump it with the engine off in order to read codes. But if you jump it with the engine running, it gives you a pretty basic oxygen sensor test. So what it's doing right now is the quick flashes, like what it's doing right now, that means that it's in open loop. Then when it goes to the slow flashes, that means it's in closed loop. A one-wire oxygen sensor has to be much closer to the engine. As far as the exhaust tubing, it's got to be closer to the engine so that it can stay hotter in order to work right. This one had a 3-wire, and the extra 2 wires are for a heater that's built into the sensor to keep it warm. So my guess is maybe that was the reason this 1 wire kept going in and out of open and closed loop, because I've kept it revved up here at about 1500 RPM for a few minutes, and it stayed in closed loop the whole time. So maybe that's what the deal is. Maybe the original sensor died, and then the one I got from the parts store was also broken. That's the best I can come up with right now. All right, I'm gonna check the codes real quick. So the first code it's gonna do is code 12. So it's gonna be 1, 1, 2 for 12. That one just means it's in its diagnostic mode. So this code should be 24, and it is. So it's 1, 2 for 2, 1, 2, 3, 4 for 4, so 24. And it's gonna do the code 3 times and then move to the next one. So 4. I might have missed it. So that was 4. There it is. So code 44 is the lean code for the oxygen sensor. So I didn't expect it to reset, but that was the code I was getting with the original. When this whole problem started, that was the code I was getting. Code 24, that's going to be a speed sensor, probably one of the ABS doesn't work. But I guess I'm going to go ahead and, I don't think I want to clear the code quite yet. I'm going to hook the new O2 gauge, or the new O2 sensor up the same way I have this used one hooked up, and we'll make sure that it's not some kind of a wiring issue. This is the manual that I've been using, and here's where it talks about testing the sensor. It's got some little diagrams. And per the instructions, the meter's hooked up to the negative side of the battery. It's red, but it's on the negative side of the battery. to the lead, and then the other lead is going to the negative wire of the sensor. Oh, so another thing that's worth noting is anytime you're messing with sensor wire on a car, is you do not want to have either of your probes in the current testing ports. The, I guess, short explanation for that is if you have it testing, if you have it over here, you know, well, I guess at least on this one, the negative really should only ever be in the COM port. But with the positive in the volt, ohm, whatever diode checking port, there's some safeties built into the meter that limit current flow. If I took this, put it over here in this 400 milliamp or this 10 amp one for sure, and I went and tried to measure voltage at a sensor wire, it would kill the computer. Because these two do not limit current flow, and you'll basically use the meter as a dead short from the computer to ground, and that'll pretty much immediately kill it. So anytime testing with sensor wire, you got to be careful about what you're doing and really try and keep track of what you're doing, and always keep the meter in the whatever volt, ohm checking mode, and don't put it in the current testing mode. And as soon as you're done testing something with current, go ahead and just swap it back over here so that you don't have to worry about it. So that's kind of been my best practice with that. So under the car, here's how I had this one wire hooked up. So this is the wrong sensor for this car because it's just a one wire. It doesn't have the heating element in it. But I use these little alligator clip deals. Tied them together down here, and the white one is running to the sensor wire for the ECM. So that's how I was able to monitor it with the DVOM, the multimeter, as well as have the computer monitoring it. So I'm gonna go ahead, swap in the new one again, do this test again, and see what happens. Well, now I'm confused. So this is with the sensor that I thought was the new sensor, which I thought was having a problem. It seems to be working well now. So the only thing I changed is how it was hooked up. So now I'm thinking maybe that plug is the problem. And the sensor's also staying in closed loop, which I couldn't get it to do before. So here's another test. If I crack the throttle open, it should go lean, and then as the throttle, so if I crack the throttle open and close it, it should go lean with the burst of air that it gets, and then go rich as soon as the blades close. Which is exactly what it did. It went down to 0.1 when the blades opened, and then went up to 0.6 when they closed. Alright, you're just going to have to forgive me because I forgot to film it, but the plug in the wiring harness that this plugs into, I really started to suspect that is the problem, because without this one plugged into the harness, you know, and using my jumper wires, this one worked fine. And then I got the original one to the car, or at least the one that's been on it the whole time I've owned it, hooked that one up the exact same way, and it acted fine. Seemed to be measuring correctly, went into closed loop without any issues, didn't trip the check engine light. So I started looking at the plug that this goes into. I didn't immediately see anything wrong, but a bad connection in that plug was the only thing I could come up with. So I kind of poked it up here into the engine bay where it was easier to get to. And I had a little file attachment. It wasn't super abrasive, but a tiny little rotary attachment for the Dremel that would fit inside the plug. And I got that in there, and I just kind of worked it around the plug and cleaned it up as best I could, and then put it back together. And I'm hoping that is what the problem was. If it's not, then that I'm a little bit confused. But so far, it has the original sensor in it, and it's been running here for probably 10 minutes. It's been staying in closed loop. It hasn't tripped the check engine light yet. So I'm hoping it was just a bad connection at this plug that was the problem. So I'm gonna go drive it for a bit and see what happens. All right, I think I got this figured out and got the last of the mice house out of this thing. So this purple wire that has the solder and heat shrink on it, these things are really cool. I don't remember what they're called, but they have the solder built into them, so you just heat it up with the heat gun and it just takes care of everything for you. And on little stuff like this, I really like it. It's a lot easier than trying to get a soldering iron in here. But this purple wire, which I can't tell, it's like either D6 or D7, solid purple wire, that is the signal wire for the O2 sensor. So I cut it here, tied on a new piece of wire to the end going to the computer, ran that to the plug on the sensor. I just bent it over, shoved it in there, taped the whole thing up, zip tied it away from the exhaust, drove the car for a week, and the problem went away. No check engine light. The computer was reading, it seemed like it was reading a lot better on the check engine light test, where you have that jumper wire and the, I'm pretty sure it's the AB terminals. It was acting way more consistent, and it wouldn't, before it would just, the check engine light would go off completely, meaning that the computer was seeing a lean condition, and it wouldn't come back on for minutes, or if maybe even most of my commute, it wouldn't come back on. It would say that it was lean the entire time. When I bypassed the factory wiring, that problem went away. It would sit there, it'd flash on, off, like it was real consistent and smooth. If I let off the gas completely and coasted, it would go lean. If I quickly got on the gas, it would say rich, which is something it would never do before. It would always just say lean, or maybe it would flicker on a little bit. But before, it would never even say that it was seeing a rich condition. So getting rid of the factory wiring fixed the problem. So I went and did a little more digging, and I cut the signal wire at the plug for the sensor. So the factory wiring harness, I cut the wire, tied onto it, jumped it back down to the sensor, and the problem still didn't come back. So the problem is somewhere in the factory plug, and I couldn't figure out how to unpin it, so I just jumpered my own wire around it, which I'll look at here in a second. But yeah, so the way I figured this out, because it was frustrating Googling around, I mean, people's logic on this issue didn't make any sense. It had a code for a lean condition, but the car was getting terrible mileage. I mean, this thing usually gets 19 to 20, and I was getting 11. I mean, the mileage was absolutely horrific. So, you know, you look online and everybody's like, oh yeah, that lean code, yeah, that means you have low fuel pressure. You need to do the fuel pump. All right, this is a list of things that I read could be the issue and some things that I thought of on my own. So the most common answers I saw for this, as far as in forums, the first one was a fuel delivery issue of some kind, whether that's the pump, filter, injectors, lines. That, I don't think that could ever be the issue in this situation, because the car was getting terrible mileage. I mean, it was getting about half the mileage that it should have. The fuel system was just dumping the coals to the motor, trying to compensate for this supposed lean condition. So the fuel system is capable of putting the fuel to the motor, so I don't think it was the issue. And when I saw all the soot trailing out of the exhaust, clearly that gas was actually getting burned. It wasn't like the car had a fuel leak or something like that. Second most common thing was a vacuum leak. Everybody said vacuum leaks will cause this. I haven't experienced a vacuum leak on a TBI setup, so I don't know exactly what it would do. But the TBI setup uses a MAP sensor, which measures manifold vacuum. If you have a vacuum leak, that sensor is going to see it, and it's going to try and compensate for it. So I don't think it would cause that much of an issue. I mean, at some point, it and the throttle position sensor are not going to be in agreement, and the computer's probably going to get upset about that. But I don't see how that would cause anything like the issue that this car was having. I don't see how it could cause a lean condition while the engine is actually running rich. EGR was another thing that everybody said. EGR, I don't see any way that that could cause an issue. Well, I don't see how that could cause a false lean condition, because the EGR is just recycling exhaust back into the intake, and if it does that, the oxygen sensor should be able to read it correctly. So that leads to, well, maybe the O2 sensor is bad. Well, we checked it. O2 sensor obviously was working the way it was supposed to. So, not that. Wiring issue? That's a pretty solid guess. Bad computer? That's a pretty solid guess, but computer is a hard thing to check, and it's a expensive thing to replace, generally speaking. So computer is an absolute last-ditch effort if everything else has been ruled out and there's no other explanation. An exhaust leak, that would actually be a really good one. If there's an exhaust leak before the oxygen sensor, that's going to introduce raw air into the exhaust, and it's going to trick the sensor into thinking that there's a lean condition. I checked the exhaust between the sensor and the engine. There wasn't an exhaust leak, so that was not the issue. So it's like, okay, clearly the car is running rich. The computer thinks it's running lean. And I checked earlier, I checked the sensors, both sensors, the one that was in the car and the new one that I bought. Both those sensors checked out and were working correctly. So the sensor's working correctly, the car is running incredibly rich, and the computer is getting a signal that says lean. Well, a lean signal happens to correspond with low voltage, and resistance in the circuit will cause low voltage. So that was what the problem was, is there's a bunch of resistance in that factory plug at the end of the wiring harness, and that was taking the rich voltage, like whatever it was, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, whatever the voltage was that the sensor was putting out, that resistance was taking that and dumbing it down to 0.1, 0.2 or whatever, which was telling the computer that the motor needed more fuel even though it didn't. So that was what the problem was. There really wasn't anything broken other than that little section of the circuit. So under the car here, got the sensor, and unfortunately I can't pull this down any farther, but so there you can see where I snipped the signal wire off of the O2 sensor. It comes out here. I put a spade connector on it, ran it to a new length of wire, and I pulled this part of the car's harness. I pulled it up into the engine bay and added this length of wire. Otherwise I never would have been able to get my hands up in here next to the transmission. But this piece of wire is soldered onto the factory signal wire up there. So this spade connector is now the connection for the signal wire from the sensor to the computer. And then I just put a piece of heat shrink over it and shrunk it down just so it's protected by the weather. But if it wasn't clear earlier, the problem is somewhere right here in this end of the connector. The heating circuit works fine, but this connection right here for the signal wire, something is wrong and it's not making a good connection, and I don't know why. I tried cleaning it out with the Dremel and that didn't really do anything. But anyways, that was the problem. Alright, so you can see the check engine light flashing, just cruising down the road. So the flashes are pretty even, showing that the air-fuel mixture is pretty much ideal. So if I let off the gas, it goes lean, which is shown by the light turning off. And then if I get on it, it stays on longer. So that was kind of a nice feature that they put into these. Gave you the ability to see what the reading from the O2 sensor is. And so the slow flashing like this means that it's in closed loop. That means the computer is actually using the data from the sensor. All the conditions have been met for the computer to use the data from the sensor. So the sensor's got to be warm enough, the engine temp's got to be warm enough, and there's probably some other little things that I'm not aware of. If the light's just on off real quick, just flashing back and forth, then that means that it's in open loop, meaning that the computer is not using the data from the sensor because some criteria isn't satisfied. So anyways, happy to finally have this sorted, and I think we'll call that a wrap.